Welcome or welcome back. If you're back, thank you so much for coming back. I'm Maria and I make videos about America and its place in the world and just social and political commentary in general. So this is your first time? Hey! Wow. What a week. If you've never seen my videos before, or if you haven't seen the first video I ever made on this channel, I made a pledge that I would try and talk about some, hot topics and controversial issues in as ethical and unbiased way as I could. So with that said, given everything that's happened with the election,
well, not everything, because some of it's been an absolute shit show.
Given the topic I'm going to be talking about and my own personal affiliations and opinions, there might be some bias throughout this video, but I am trying to keep it as objective and informative as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. Given the fact that we just saw an election happen in the United States, I thought it would be a really good opportunity to dive into the idea of voter suppression. Now, right off the bat, I just want to say that this video is not going to be as in-depth as it could be. Voter suppression is such a long-standing and complicated topic that could honestly be a video series all on its own. It could be a documentary series all on its own and still leave a lot to be said. My goal for this video is to briefly go over the origins of voter suppression in this country and to kind of parallel that with some of the ways in which voter suppression is still happening. So I think that understanding why something exists and how it started, as well as the ways in which it's still at work in our society, is a great jumping off point for getting educated, learning more about it, and ultimately working against it. So I just want this video to be kind of a jumping off point for those of us who have maybe heard voter suppression be tossed around as a term a lot this election cycle, but may not be entirely sure what it means or what exactly it entails. So with all of that being said, let's just go ahead and start. So if you even loosely followed the 2020 election, which, let's be real, you probably did whether you wanted to or not, chances are that there are certain buzzwords that you probably heard more than once, to say the least. I think even people who aren't particularly involved in politics kind of know that this election was an unusual one. Voter turnout was at an all-time high. Joe Biden received more votes than any other president in the history of the US. Mail-in ballots were cast at record levels, and more young people and minorities voted in this election than pretty much ever before. And of course, COVID-19 was a thing during pretty much the entire election year, which really changed the way we talked about and did the election. So very unusual. So despite the fact that this election was really historic in terms of voter turnout, even months before the election happened, there were widespread conversations about voter suppression going on, and honestly, justifiably so. Unfortunately, voter suppression is a reality of our contemporary voting system, and it's a very important part of our ongoing conversations about things like democracy and justice, especially over the last 4 years. So to start, let's quickly define voter suppression so that we're all on the same page. So voter suppression is when an election is influenced by efforts to intimidate, discourage, or just generally prevent specific groups of people from voting. So just to provide some context, conversations about voter suppression in this 2020 election mostly centered around the suppression of Black, Native, Latino, and generally low-income voters. But before we talk about the role of voter suppression or attempted voter suppression in this 2020 election, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of voter suppression in the United States. So lots of people actually argue that voter suppression has been applied to our voting and electoral systems for as long as they've existed. I disagree with that. I don't think that voter suppression has been applied to our systems. I would argue that voter suppression was inherent to the American electoral system when it was established. After all, when the Constitution granted Americans the right to vote and participate in government, it wasn't granting that right to all Americans. It was granting that right to wealthy, white, land-owning American males. Everyone else, women, Native people, Black people, and any other racial minorities was not given the right to vote or to participate in government at all. And that's a really important precedent to talk about because it means that every single effort that happened afterwards to expand the vote to other people was working against the established status quo. It was an uphill climb to grant other groups like women and minorities the right to vote. And that's the right to vote under law, because if we've seen anything time and time again over the course of American history, it's that being granted the right to vote according to legal theory is not the same thing as being granted practical means by which to actually vote. For example, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1870, granted Black men and other men from racial minorities the right to vote on paper. However, there was extreme voter suppression focused at Black and Native communities, and then eventually over the course of the 20th century in poor communities of color in general. For example, in 1896, which was relatively shortly after the 15th Amendment was passed, 130,000 Black men in Louisiana were registered to vote. In 1904, just 8 years later, that number was 1,300. Similarly, at the turn of the century in Mississippi, only 6% of the state's Black male population was eligible to vote. Not even registered, just eligible. Just as they do now, the mechanisms of voter suppression really vary state by state. However, two efforts of voter suppression were fairly common and widespread at that time. The first of those is poll taxes. So poll taxes were instilled in the 1890s, and basically there were laws that required any eligible voter whose families did not vote prior to the Civil War to pay a fee before registering to vote. This is such a perfect example of how disproportionately Black Americans were disenfranchised. For example, poor white people who also couldn't afford poll taxes were usually able to circumvent them because they had ancestors who had voted prior to the Civil War. However, because of the law, no Black person had that luxury. As a result, poor Black communities in the United States were barred from voting almost entirely for decades. Poll taxes were actually challenged and defended twice at the federal level. The first time was in 1937 by the Supreme Court, and the second time was by another federal court in 1951. It actually wasn't until 1964, almost 100 years after the passage of the 15th Amendment, that poll taxes were overturned in court. The second fairly widespread means of voter suppression that happened over the course of the early to mid 20th century was literacy testing. Literacy testing was widely aimed at keeping poor communities of color from voting, primarily in the American South. And like poll taxes, people were exempt from literacy tests if they had ancestors who voted during the antebellum period or if they owned property, meaning that a lot of poor white people who happened to be illiterate were usually able to circumvent literacy tests because they fell into one of those two criteria. The thing about literacy tests is that they were intentionally doled out really disproportionately. So there's evidence, particularly in the South and states like Alabama, of Black voters being given more difficult questions than white voters for their literacy exams. In fact, a lot of the questions that were given to Black voters in literacy tests couldn't be answered by modern college graduates. As more and more immigrants came to the United States in the early 20th century and obtained citizenship, literacy tests expanded to sort of suppressing various kinds of voters from many different backgrounds. But the common denominator was that they were aimed at low-income communities of color. It wasn't until 1970 that literacy tests were made illegal. So where does that leave us today, right? Like, how does that translate into anything that we may be seeing today as far as voter suppression? Well, of course, things have changed. Registering to vote is free, and no convoluted literacy test is given as a prerequisite to people based on their race. However, there remain various obstacles to voting that disproportionately affect poor communities and communities of color in this country. So let's talk about some modern iterations of voter suppression that have a demonstrated impact on voter turnout. First off, we have absentee voting restrictions. There are some states like Georgia and North Carolina that have laws in place that make early and absentee voting a lot more difficult. Methods like early voting and absentee voting are used by low-income communities really often because these are the people who can't afford to take an entire day off work or to have their hours cut just to go vote in person on election day. An example of one of the ways that absentee ballots are subject to voter suppression is in Georgia. In Georgia, voters are required to pay for their own postage for their ballots. It might seem small, but again, these are the things that really impact people living in poverty. And this is actually something that's currently being challenged by the ACLU because it essentially serves the same function as the poll tax. Another modern manifestation of voter suppression is the limitation of ballot drop-off locations. So one of the things that really caused widespread outrage during the 2020 election was the fact that so many states had very, very scarce ballot drop-off locations. Highly populated states like Texas, and another example is Ohio, actually had laws that limited ballot drop-off locations to 1 per county. This means that people who are living in rural or secluded communities, aka lower income people, have a much harder time accessing ballot drop-off locations than wealthier people who live in urban or suburban areas. Often, people who live in rural or isolated communities have to travel a lot longer and take a lot more time in order to cast their absentee ballots than people who are living in more central urban locations. And another example of voter suppression is information scarcity. So the extent to which voting information is provided on mail-in ballots and absentee ballots themselves really strongly differs from state to state. Some states, like California, provide a shit ton of information within the official ballot package itself. This includes information about how to vote correctly, the addresses of different ballot drop-off locations, the stances and policies of each candidate who's up for election, and even arguments for or against propositions and laws that are being voted on. Other states, like Florida and Texas, do not provide any additional information about the candidates or propositions that are being voted on. They literally just provide the options. This means that voters are forced to do independent research when it comes to voting for or against a candidate or a proposition. This may seem minor, but again, low-income voters are the ones who are most affected by this, because imagine having to work 2 or 3 jobs, barely having time to cast your ballot, and then having to do maybe hours of independent research in order to reach a baseline level of information and vote. So another long-standing manifestation of voter suppression is felon disenfranchisement, which basically means that people who have been incarcerated due to felonies are no longer given the right to vote. Just in 2020, that means that about 5.1 million people were not able to cast their vote. Now, the prison industrial complex in general is a super complicated topic, and I would definitely be open to researching extensively and creating a whole video about that. But suffice it to say, for the purposes of this video, that anyone who's been incarcerated, even for a first-time nonviolent offense, is stripped of their right to vote for years and maybe even for their entire life. The last means of voter suppression that I'm going to focus on in this video, although there are many more, is voter intimidation. Voter intimidation goes back as far as the 15th Amendment. There is a long-standing history in this country of threats of violence or even threats of murder being used against minority communities and especially Black communities in order to suppress their voting. Some pretty widely known examples include lynchings, particularly in the American South in the early to mid 20th century, but voter intimidation continued through the 2020 election. Statements like Trump's instruction of the far-right domestic terrorist group, the Proud Boys, to stand back and stand by in the weeks leading up to the election was absolutely a manifestation of voter intimidation. So, knowing the many ways in which voter suppression is still alive in this country and looking toward the future, what can we draw from all of this? I think it's safe to say that the results of the 2020 election have a lot of people, full disclosure, myself included, feeling like they can really exhale for the first time in a long time. And we have to acknowledge that the results of this election are due largely in part to the communities who have faced the worst of voter suppression over the course of this country's history. For example, in Nevada, many of the locations that flipped from red to blue in 2020 were actually Native reservations, which sometimes can be up to 2 hours away from the closest polling location to them. In Georgia, the iconic Stacey Stacey Abrams and various other organizers, especially women of color, led various initiatives over the course of years to combat voter suppression. Due to organizations like the New Georgia Project and the Fair Fights Project, both of which were founded by Miss Abrams, by the way, 800,000 people registered to vote in Georgia for the first time since 2014. With more information and more real-time updates available to us than ever before, more and more ordinary, not too political Americans are becoming informed about and joining the conversation about voter suppression in the United States. More and more people are becoming aware of the fact that voter suppression is an unfortunate but undeniable part of our electoral system. Though that's kind of a bleak thing to admit and to say, it also means that efforts to mobilize against voter suppression are at an unprecedented high, and we see that with organizers like Ms. Stacey Abrams in Georgia or Ilhan Omar in Minnesota and various other organizers all across the country. The historic turnouts of this election are only one step on a long road to making sure that voter suppression is no longer a reality in our country. But with organizers like Miss Abrams and Richard Williams and Talissa Clark and the countless organizations led by passionate anti-voter suppression activists all over the country, particularly in the South, I can't help but be optimistic about our fight for voting equality.
Maybe I'm just still riding my Biden-Harris bliss.
I don't know. But with all of that said, that's essentially a very brief overview of voter suppression in the United States. Like I said, this is such a complicated topic. I could do an entire video series on just the history of voter suppression in the US. If that's something you'd be interested in, please let me know. Another thing that I know I didn't mention in this video is the Electoral College. And that's because the Electoral College has an entire video coming about it sometime in the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that, because that's gonna be a big video. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you participated in this election in any way, you know, if you voted, if you mobilized, if you've been staying informed, thank you for, you know, participating. I know it's been a really stressful year in many ways, and this election was just one of them. And I am really hopeful that we're going to move forward with unity and level-headedness and a capacity to hold our new administration accountable to all of the promises they made. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much for participating in the conversations we have here on this channel. Give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. I post new videos every Tuesday, and I would really love to hear from you what you want to hear about in these videos. Whatever it is, leave a comment below. I would really love to know. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye!